a lot of policy effort is now focusing hard onto the whole question of levelling up. And a huge part of that, of course, is the whole question of local leadership, local government, devolution, that whole nexus of questions. This is something that has been a live policy debate in the UK, at least since the Redcliffe-Maud report. It's been something we've been thinking about for a long time. And it's something which the government is grappling with at the moment as a live issue. So we're incredibly lucky to have with us really a kind of a Swiss Army knife of a kind of panel today here, because we've got people who can come at every single different aspect of this question. We have, starting with order, we're going to start with Simon Clarke, a former member of the Treasury Select Committee, a former Economic Secretary to Treasury, and also the former Minister for Regional Growth and Local Government, who brings a huge amount of direct experience in government to this issue, and also hails from Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, which is one kind of place, it's kind of conurbation, which faced in recent decades some serious challenges. Now we're going to go to Jo Gideon, who has been a businesswoman, but also a social entrepreneur. She's been a councillor, but she's also been on a kind of town centre management committee. So she's bringing a different perspective again, and again, hailing from an interesting place in Stoke-on-Trent Central. That is a city that's, not the biggest city, but it's quite a large city, and it's kind of got a strong up and coming kind of vibe to it, the new council leadership and lots of things going on there. So that's a different perspective again. And then we were going to jump on to Professor Philip McCann, who a lot of people know is an incredibly distinguished and prolific author on all questions of local economic and social policy. He's been an advisor to the European Commission, to the European Investment Bank, the OECD. Everybody wants to listen to him. His book on the UK national regional economic problem, I can really commend to everybody on the call. I do think there's a plot spoiler though in it. You get to about page 80 and it tells you the UK regional national economic problem is about having serious economic disparities, but with weak local leadership to address them. And the book is about like 500 pages long. There should be a warning that there's going to be a spoiler about the answer coming about page 80, and nonetheless, it's a tremendous book, and I would recommend everything that Philip's ever done to you. And then last but absolutely not least, we're going to go to Vidya Alexan, who is currently the Chief Executive of Power to Change, but also a huge heritage in lots of different think tanks in the US and the UK. She's previously the Deputy CEO at Resolution Foundation. She's a trustee of the Young Foundation. She's a board member of More in Common, which is a trust I think a lot about, because when I sit in Parliament, I sit opposite the memorial to Jo Cox, who has on her little shield the memorial, that slogan, More in Common, which is about combating radicalisation and polarisation. And Vidya is again bringing a different perspective about going down to the community level, the level of the neighbourhood, the estate on the edge of town, which may be left behind, the power of the social capital, which is of course something that we at Onward are obsessed with and have been doing lots of work on. So we got 4 totally different perspectives, 4 of the leading people in the field. Tremendous lineup. So congratulations to Team Onward for bringing all these people together. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon Clarke to take us away. We're going to wrap through the agenda, and then we're going to have some Q&A. So Simon, it's over to you. Thank you so much for coming this morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed, Neil, for the invitation to join you and the Onward team today. It's a chance to reflect on some of the issues that I'm most passionate about as a constituency MP, but also clearly as the minister who was formerly responsible for this area of policy, and to share some of what I learned from my time at MHCLG in particular, but also at the Treasury, about the devolution agenda and how we can best take that forward. I enjoyed my time in this space enormously, because it is such a fast-changing and important area of policy. MHCLG is a great ministry staffed by people who care very deeply about this, and Rob Jenrick, as a Secretary of State, understands the potential of devolution to drive outperformance in the areas where we need that the most. And when the Prime Minister invited me to take up the regional growth and local government role in February 2020, he emphasised with characteristic passion that this really was, in fact, all about levelling up. This was shorthand for the mission. And of course, that was literally a month before COVID burst upon us in all its terrible drama. But as we all recognise, levelling up matters more rather than less in the context of the year that this country has been through, and which will define the rest of this Parliament and very probably the next. And so that leads us squarely to today's discussion. And put simply, devolution matters so much because it is inextricable from levelling up. No government, however able, can discharge this hugely ambitious agenda on its own. This one is rightly determined to extend economic and social opportunity more evenly across the country, but I am absolutely convinced this can only be delivered to best effect in partnership with strong and effective and devolved local government. And at present, we've overseen an incomplete revolution in terms of developing the structures that are required to make this happen. And I don't say that critically, because a lot has been achieved in the course of the last decade. And since 2010, 3 successive Conservative administrations have extended strong mayoral governments successfully beyond London, covering the West Midlands, the West of England, the North of Tyne region, the Liverpool City region, Greater Manchester, Cambridge and Peterborough, South Yorkshire, and of course my home region where I am today of the Tees Valley. I was particularly proud as Minister to help finally unlock the Sheffield City region deal. And when the first West Yorkshire Mayor is elected next month, as part of a record deal negotiated by the government, 63% of people in the north of England will be represented by strong and accountable Metro mayors. That is a real success story, and we shouldn't lose sight of the ground that we've made. Because from transport to economic regeneration to adult education and skills, our mayors are equipped to deal with some of the things that make the most difference to people's life chances. And to those sceptical about mayors really making a difference, I would point to what Ben Houchen has achieved in his 4 years in my neck of the woods. And as you referred to in your opening remarks, anyone who knows the Tees Valley knows that we're an area that almost defines why levelling up matters. Having been a shining success story based around iconic strengths in steel and chemicals and engineering, the decline of our industrial competitiveness from the 1970s onwards hit Teesside desperately hard. And I'm sure that Joe can emphasise from a Midlands perspective. Obviously, we weren't alone in that, but we were unusually reliant on a small number of core industries that had a huge employment footprint. And when that went, it has felt at times an almost Canute-like task to halt the encroaching tide of decline, where economic decay merged into social problems linked to intergenerational unemployment. All that is now changing, and from the rescue of Teesside Airport to the regeneration of the enormous site of the former SSI Steelworks up the road in Redcar, the mood has been transformed. Last month's budget contained 2 fantastic announcements, namely the creation of the government's new economic campus at Darlington, soon to be home to some 1,500 civil servants from the Treasury and the Department of International Trade, and more importantly still, the designation of the Tees as one of the UK's first post-Brexit free ports, unlocking a wave of jobs that has already seen the American giant GE Renewables commit to creating some 2,250 jobs directly and indirectly in offshore wind turbine manufacture. That's just the beginning, and many more will follow in sectors ranging from carbon capture and storage to the hydrogen economy. We know we have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who are deeply personally committed to supporting areas like mine, but do not for a moment underestimate how much hard work Ben as Mayor has had to devote to ensuring that Teesside was in a position to take advantage of the government's willingness to engage. And I've seen firsthand the really detailed and impressive submissions that had to be coordinated by the Mayoral Combined Authority. And equally as importantly, the role of the Mayoral Combined Authority in acting as a convener to build a coalition of local stakeholders, to get our local authorities working together effectively, and to think in a more strategic way about cross-cutting priorities across the region, to win the support of local businesses, and to convince both ministers and senior civil servants that Teesside could deliver. This is what we need to see much more of, and it's this which I think lies at the heart of the role of mayors as I see them, that they are the best and indeed only people who can really work to bring an area's full potential together to allow it to partner and dovetail effectively with government priorities, and to display that single point of accountability which ministers need to see in order to devolve very substantial powers and funding to help unlock improvements. Now, the fact that not every mayor has done what Ben has done is not an argument against mayors. It's an argument, of course, for better ones, people who can see the full potential of this role and how it can really change the dynamics that affect a particular area. And I am absolutely convinced that we should continue to be bold in ensuring that this model is extended elsewhere during the course of the 2020s. Exciting talks are underway at the moment with areas like Hull and the East Riding of Yorkshire, and hopefully also to create a workable solution for devolution south of the Tyne, which is the only part of the northeast now that isn't covered by devolution. And that is a missed opportunity, and it's one that we need to correct. Meanwhile, consultations are underway as we speak on the best possible design for new, strong and effective unitary authorities in Cumbria, York and North Yorkshire and Somerset. And unitary authorities can definitely be the building blocks of potential future mayoral deals. For realistically, combined authorities will only work effectively if they are relatively streamlined. I don't think mayoral combined authorities with a dozen, 20 members, which some mayoralties could conceivably end up containing if you have two-tier local government, are necessarily those structures which would be best placed to work effectively. I certainly very much hope that areas like Cumbria and North Yorkshire might get the opportunity in time, if they so wish, to follow their restructurings by opening negotiations with the government to establish new mayoralties. And for my own part, I'm clear that wherever we can build the necessary broad local consent, we should be looking to deliver on this model more widely. These mayoralties do operate on the right strategic scale to address fundamental challenges from transport infrastructure to housing need. And there is a very strong case, I think, for making a big open offer to local government across England, namely that the powers and funding open to metro mayors will be extended to all areas that come forward with credible proposals to make this happen. I don't think we should want any area to miss out on the opportunities that are flowing to the mayoral regions. The principle, as I say, of broad consent would be vital, but the chance for other areas to embrace this sort of reform should be there. And in my party, I know some colleagues are nervous about the politics of devolution and whether through it we're simply giving a soapbox for opponents to grandstand against the government. And of course, there have been instances of this during the course of the COVID pandemic and in other contexts. And that is a challenge, and it's part of the evolving maturity of the mayoral model that we learn to deal effectively with that on both sides of the local national politics divide. But I do think that we ought to be brave enough to continue to embrace it. And I would point out to my colleagues who are politically anxious about this, that many of those areas which have yet to see devolution happen would, of course, be great swathes of England outside the core cities that would be very fertile territory for my party. So in other words, to the extent that raw politics is ever a factor in these calculations, future devolution deals, if anything, offer the opportunity to redress the political balance of devolved government a little bit. There's no question that I think we can do more to strengthen the model of devolution for the future as well. And this is really the final point I wanted to raise in my opening remarks. We need to make sure that we strengthen the accountability of those to whom we devolve. Certainly for the government to devolve and forget is not an option. That's not how politics can work. We mustn't think that we can effectively say, well, these issues are now handed over in perpetuity to incumbent mayors and they're no longer the responsibility of central government. That would not be morally right. It would not be practically possible in terms of best use of taxpayers' money. And of course, politically, the government still holds responsibility in people's eyes to some degree for the outcomes that they see on the ground. So I do believe that we need to look more at this question of accountability. And I think this needs to involve much more careful assessment of both outperformance and underperformance by each individual mayoralty against transparent metrics of delivery. I think powers should be capable of flowing both ways, so that just as we are likely to devolve more, so if we see evidence of really poor use of taxpayer funding, we might consider potentially taking some powers back to central government as well. I don't think we should be afraid to have that dynamic, if you like, of allowing powers to move both ways. I also think we should look at making mayors accountable to Parliament and in particular select committees. It is surely the case that if we're equipping our mayors with functions formerly reserved only for ministers, that they in turn ought to face an equivalent level of scrutiny. And that's something I would like to see happen in the future. And I believe that most, if not all of our mayors would relish that challenge, and it would improve the overall quality of governance. So these are the kind of opportunities open to us as the settlement matures. We've come a long way in a short time. We mustn't be afraid to keep refining the model, but I'm absolutely clear that devolution works, that it should be continued with, and that it lies at the heart of the effective partnership working we are going to need to see as we deliver on levelling up.
Very good, suitably pithy, provocative, and thought-provoking. Straight over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I was absolutely delighted as well to be invited to talk about a revolution in government and how it can help Unsurprisingly, my view is not quite the same as Simon's. Stoke-on-Trent is a small unitary. We had I think, as I understand it, a failed mayoral attempt in Staffordshire some years ago, and we're not part of a combined authority, so my take on it is slightly different. Good governance is the key to the success or failure of any project, so I think it's a vital theme in the context of levelling up. Managing your money and your people well in any organisation is essential, and good governance is a prerequisite of good government. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the National Food Strategy, the first topic I introduced was what governance structures would be necessary to deliver major reforms to our entire food system following the recommendations of the independent review. The top-line conclusions apply equally well to the delivery of our levelling up agenda. Firstly, where a large number of different government departments and arm's length bodies are involved in shaping policy, to align the priorities of these different bodies, governance arrangements must have a long-term consistency of purpose and vision. Clarity of purpose and vision will accelerate and lower the cost of the transition and de-risk necessary investments from the private sector. Secondly, new structures in government are likely to be needed to coordinate day-to-day delivery against the strategy across departments. But the inherent transience of committees, units, ministers and even departments means new coordination structures alone are unlikely to be sufficient. And thirdly, independent oversight will significantly strengthen governance arrangements by monitoring long-term progress towards objectives that are set out in a levelling up strategy and ensuring accountability. The coronavirus pandemic has fundamentally changed both the public's expectations of government and the pace of change in this country. Where historically the wheels of government have ground slowly, the public health emergency and the social and economic fallout from the pandemic have necessitated swift responses. And we have seen agility and urgency, not just in our vaccination programme, but also in the distribution of emergency support packages. People understand that the government's financial support packages are short-term fixes. Calls for these fixes to be extended, I think, fail to acknowledge the unsustainability of uncontrolled borrowing or the negative impact of a tax and spend regime on our economic recovery and future prosperity. During the last year, we have learnt the true value of community and of grassroots solutions in solving local social problems. The challenge we now face is how we harness this understanding while managing unrealistic expectations that government alone should both provide and fund every solution to regional disparities and social inequalities. So I think that now is the time to demonstrate our commitment to community power and challenge the service economy model, which gives ownership of resolving local challenges to paid service providers. The culture of measuring and monitoring, of managing people through systems, passing them from one service to another, and funding services through a range of government departments does not provide the best outcomes for the most disadvantaged. It manages dependence. If we are to give back power to local communities to support their own priorities, we cannot use the same commissioning mechanisms as in the past and expect a renaissance of innovative new solutions to issues that have existed for decades. A revolution in governance means not swapping one layer of government bureaucracy for another by devolving grant giving from national to local government. Local authorities have been stretched to breaking point during the pandemic, managing extra responsibilities and statutory duties with depleted staffing numbers. And yet they are facing a new deluge of bid writing expectations, and for those who make it past the first hurdle, extra project management, delivery deadlines, evaluation and governance procedures aplenty. For many local authorities, this is simply unrealistic. So I would like to see a range of alternative governance arrangements being explored for our Levelling Up programme. This may include, for instance, a transformational Levelling Up board of local leaders, providing the administration and governance of a devolved generic funding pot to smaller grassroots organisations, and a collaborative network led by third sector organisations, but not exclusively third sector, agreeing a programme to address local priorities, and being the accountable body for devolved grant funding. And secondly, LEPs, Chambers of Commerce, and new local enterprise development boards, including private businesses as well as education providers, to target the plan for jobs and the enterprise agenda. And thirdly, support for finance institutions to provide micro grants, loans and startup capital to those least likely to qualify for support through the usual finance channels, including repurposing the scope of the big society capital and growing sustainable finance through place-based lenders such as community development financial institutions. Government is rightly careful with taxpayers' money, but the focus on value for money in the procurement process does not factor in risk. Often over-complex procurement and evaluation processes lead to extremely good but small grassroots organisations failing to secure the support they need. We should stop tweaking existing policies and instead look at radical, innovative solutions to tackle our regional inequalities. One example, and Simon mentioned it earlier, is the relocation of government offices. When tasked with looking for second homes for offices, civil servants, I believe, looked at the next largest cities, with Darlington being the exception, Simon. So Manchester and Birmingham have received significant support in a number of ministries. I think if the purpose of spreading the government estate is to level up, then this must be clearly stated as the primary driver and reflected in the planning. And we'd love to welcome something in Stoke. A year of home working by many in the civil service, I think, has proved conclusive evidence that we don't need to force people to commute into the capital or larger cities on a daily basis. We could use any government department relocations to reinvigorate our local economies and local high streets, offer better paid jobs, more job opportunities, and a better quality of life in the less affluent towns across our regions. Apart from the economic benefit, it also sends out a clear message that government is genuine in its agenda to level up employment opportunities across all the areas of the country. Doing things differently means assessing risk in a different way. Many statutory bodies produce unsatisfactory results, delivering services to the hardest to reach groups. And if we want voluntary and community organisations to take on this role, we cannot award contracts on the basis of old models of engagement or measures of success. That is not to say good practice, policies such as safeguarding and financial accountability are not essential criteria, but also social value, which is included in the commissioning criteria, must be given more weighting. I believe levelling up will require a paradigm shift in the way government rebalances the economy, not only in terms of its investment strategy, but also in developing a new, less prescriptive governance framework to allow existing and emerging community delivery mechanisms to flourish. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jo. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Very kind of challenging, kind of different take, but it was almost Thatcher-esque kind of ring to your thing about not rolling back, one tier of government only to replace it with another remote tier of government, and the challenge of some of the things that we've talked about in since 2010 of we've had the big society and so on, of actually really stripping away all these processes that stop local empowerment. So lots of interesting stuff there. We're going to jump straight on to Professor McCann.
Hi Neil, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to this meeting. So I come at these from, I'm an academic, I'm a bookie person, so I'm not involved in any politics or something. So I look at these things from a different perspective. What I do is I spend my time with my head in books and with data and so on. And I've had quite a lot of correspondence with both Neil and Will over recent months about some of these issues. So the first thing I would say is the most important thing is to understand the scale of the challenge and the nature of the challenge. And now I'm one of the people who's basically demonstrated that the UK is today one of, if not the most unequal interregionally at least, countries in the world. But if you go back 5 or 6 years, no one said that. Hardly anybody said that. I mean, I was saying these things and there was a small number of people, but it was really hard to get any traction. Whereas now there are, this is something that slowly people have started to wake up to. And actually Neil's articles, two articles back in 2012 in The Spectator, were the only thing I'd seen for many years in the broadly media political arena that really identify the nature of the problem. The problem that basically, as I understand it in terms of the data, is that the UK has been decoupling internally for several decades. And the reason is that going back, let's say 20, 30, 40 years, so you're going back to the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, is that the way we thought about the economy in terms of the modern era of globalization is broadly the primary role of London as a global city. London will act as a driver. So basically making sure that London works. And of course, if you go back to the 1970s, London was really struggling in comparison to many other large global cities, and depopulation and all sorts. Is getting London to work will then galvanize and stimulate the whole economy. So you get a lot of spread effects in terms of innovation, financial investment, entrepreneurship, new ways of kind of forming industrial partnerships. There's all these different things that this is the understood kind of accepted view. And this pretty much traversed all political parties, all institutions, think tanks, arms of government, and governance broadly. The problem is that is not what has happened. And that's the fundamental difficulty that we're dealing with now, is that parts of the economy of effectively decoupling from the rest of the country, and the data tells you the story. And the problem is that we tend to refer to everything by referring to our own experience previously, what a previous government did, or what a previous minister came up with, or a previous policy. The only way you can understand it is by looking at the experience of other countries. They haven't gone through the same process as us. In many countries have to a smaller extent, some to a similar extent, but nobody in quite the nature that we have. So that's the nature of the problem. The scale of the problem is that, well, today we are more interregionally unequal than Germany after reunification. In fact, we're about as interregionally unequal today as Germany was at the point of reunification. That's the scale of the problem. Germany has been basically spending about 70 billion euros a year for 30 years to counter the decoupling process that's required in terms of the integration process. You know, just think about the figures that we're talking about. They're minuscule in comparison. But the problem in the UK is just as big, and it's not going away. Now, I can say this because I'm not political. Brexit will make it worse. Why? Because the weaker parts of the UK are more dependent on trade with the rest of Europe than the more prosperous parts of the UK. This is an irony of the fact that levelling up has come out in some sense of the Brexit process. But this is why it's so important to have this discussion now, because not only it's so important anyway, but it's actually got more important than it was even several years ago. So the fact that there is now this political thinking at so many levels of how do we devolve, how do we decentralize, and why should we do it, I think is extremely important. I think the city region model that Simon was talking about, I think it's a very good step in the right direction. I don't think it's the solution. I don't think it's the end point, but I think it's something very important to build on. I have to, you know, I'm an independent member of the investment advisory panel for the Liverpool City region. I think that this is the way forward, but it's not the complete solution. I think Joe's completely correct on this. The problem is our country internally is so heterogeneous. Now, if you are a country which is internally, in geographical terms, very homogeneous, very similar, so you take a small country like the Netherlands, or a large geographical country with small population like New Zealand, or a very large country on every dimension like Japan. If you have national policies on anything, whether it's regulatory issues, skills training, transport infrastructure, anything you roll out as a national policy, more or less will work the same in Tokyo in the middle, in Hokkaido in the north, and Kyushu in the south, or in Christchurch in the south, Auckland in the north, Wellington in the middle, because they're all sort of the same. And so if a policy is well designed, it will have more or less similar effects that can be translated. You'll see it at the national level and also at the local regional level. That is simply not true in the UK. The differences between Barnsley and Marlborough are simply, you know, they span the whole experience of productivity across places at European levels. You know, at the OECD NUTS 3 level, which is the small 500,000 population areas, you know, productivity variations in the UK are as big as the whole of the Eurozone. You know, the business cycles, I mean, Deutsche Bank research pointed this out almost a decade ago. Business cycles in the UK across regions are less correlated than they are between countries across the Eurozone, and actually the wider non-Eurozone countries as well. That's the challenge we're faced with. The problem is our governance system is also almost uniquely ill-equipped and ill-designed to do that. And that's why we're having these discussions. So my final point is this: how to think about it in a nutshell. A top-down centralized governance system, by definition, maximizes the degrees of separation between everybody, because everyone is competing for one or two access points at the top. So it's always the same usual suspects, whether they're big companies or institutions or think tanks, whatever, it doesn't matter, universities. What happens is they are the only people who get a hearing over and over again. And so anything which is local, people give up from the start. It's completely pointless. You can't get things done in the way that other countries can. How do small countries solve it? By being small. You know, that's the New Zealand case, the Sweden case, the Finland case. Small countries, by definition, have very limited degrees of separation. So people believe they're incentivized to engage with the government because they know they're likely to get a hearing at a high level. And that process also works from the center down, that the center learns from the local by the same process. In large countries, most countries solve that by being federal. I mean, most of the action in the US takes place at the levels of states and cities. What goes on in Washington is very far removed. Australia is the same. What goes on in Canberra is largely irrelevant to what's going on in Perth. What happens at the state level and the city level? Germany is exactly the same. Switzerland's the same. Belgium is the same. This is how these countries work. It allows the center to learn from the local, and it allows the local to engage seriously with bottom-up energy, if you like, to develop systems, programs, policies, engagement systems, and so on. We have a vacuum in the middle. Probably Scotland has got out of that trap. And the optimal size in terms of the OECD, that seems to be the case, is between about 2.5 and 5 million units. You can have levels under this, but in terms of multi-level governance functioning, you need to have units which are close enough to the local, at the same time big enough to be meaningful if you do something. And this is where both Japan and China and Japan and France have been devolving for 25 years, and they're now moving to those levels. They were the other two very centralized top-down societies along with ourselves. We are 25 years late to this discussion, but at least we're having it now. That's the important point.
Very, very interesting, this point about optimum governance areas. It also reminded me of a colleague who went to do some business in Iceland. They had a problem, so they went around to the Icelandic Prime Minister's house and they sorted it out. You know, there's things you can do in small countries. Before we get to the video, I just sort of say, please do start posting your questions into the chat. Onward's vast army of chat administrators will then pick them up, and we will work through them once we get to the Q&A. But without any further ado, over to you, video.
Thanks very much, Neil. It's been fascinating. So looking forward to the discussion, and thanks to Onward for the chance to be part of this. I mean, I very much think that we need radical devolution if we're serious about levelling up. And I think that needs to get right down to the level of the neighbourhood, echoing some of the things that Joe said. And I think it was striking that a month or so ago, when the British Academy published its report on the societal impacts of COVID, it identified sorting out multi-level governance as being central to ensuring that we as a country can rebuild and continue well over a decade addressing the societal impacts of COVID. And I very much see neighbourhood level governance as part of a tiered system of governance. But I think there's a serious challenge with not pushing right down to the neighbourhood level. I think the usual recipe, particularly focused at regional level, mayoral combined authorities, about how we address levelling up, increasing R&D spend, transport infrastructure, improving education skills, all of which are important. But I think there's three elements that are missing in that recipe for how we address levelling up. The first, I think it leaves neighbourhoods behind. These places that are left behind there isn't a trickle down from improvements in regional GDP. So when I talk to people in places like Dyke House in Hartlepool, they haven't seen the benefit moving to their neighbourhood of the Teesside International Airport. And I think making sure that we're not leaving these places perpetually behind is a key part of why we need to push some power down to the neighbourhood level. The second element is really around the social dimension of levelling up, which is something that Onward has really pushed and done excellent research on. Much of the focus, and we see this in many of the government's levelling up funds, is very much on the economic dimensions of levelling up, on infrastructure, etc. But we know, and increasingly it's coming through in research, that it improves people's experience of living in places, to improve their lives, their quality of life, there are significant social dimensions to that. Improving the social fabric of neighbourhoods is a critical part of the levelling up agenda, I think. And some recent research by Pro Bono Economics showed that the presence of a range of different kinds of community assets, whether that's leisure centres and pubs or post offices, the kind of assets that make up the fabric of everyday life, are a better predictor of life satisfaction in an area than GDP or average household income. And yet we seem to neglect that when we think about levelling up, and we treat it very much as a purely economic endeavour. The two have to go hand in hand. And I think from a political point of view, and I'm not a politician, it feels like that if we don't grasp this aspect of combining the economic and the social and putting that down to the neighbourhood level, then we're missing a huge trick in terms of changing people's lives and them seeing an improvement in their day-to-day lives. And then the third dimension, which I think is really important in terms of why we need to get down to the neighbourhood level, is that there is a risk that people see levelling up as something that's being done to them. And I just came out of a conversation where this was being discussed. And I think the difference between an agenda around levelling up that can really start with community engagement around community-led economic development as part of the multi-level approach to levelling up avoids that risk. And we know that in many of our most disadvantaged neighbourhoods, people coming in and bringing investment in has often left many of the people who were there already behind through speculative investment, through buying up housing to create instability in local housing markets. So there is a really key dimension to engaging local people if this levelling up agenda is going to embrace everybody and address those places that are most left behind. And I think, much as Joe has already said, the pandemic points the way forward, revealing how communities can self-organise to address inequalities and work alongside the state to really try to tackle some of these very entrenched inequalities at neighbourhood level. And going back to the British Academy study, it highlights the critical role of communities and social infrastructure in creating resilience in places going forward. So I think to really fully realise the vision of levelling up and address those left behind places that I've talked about, we need to devolve power to the neighbourhood level. And the Prime Minister's speech just after the election that he gave in Manchester at the end of 2019 talked about returning power to communities and people taking responsibility over their own destinies. And I think we need to connect power to existing neighbourhood level structures, whether that's neighbourhood forums, existing community anchors, community development trusts. There are a number of organisations at neighbourhood level that could be part of that multi-framework of devolution. And I think the devolution white paper, when it arrives, is a real opportunity to build on the energy that we've seen in the pandemic and reward communities essentially for the incredible role they've played in COVID, and show that they can be part of this levelling up agenda going forward. I think the power needs to be supported with funding, and I think the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is the best opportunity to do that. We would argue, along with others in the community sector, that 25% of that overall pot should be devolved directly to neighbourhoods and controlled by organisations at neighbourhood level. And I think the evidence from regeneration programmes in the past show that a long-term approach with local control, connecting communities as well to larger economic structures, can be effective in terms of addressing left behind places. And I just want to give you two examples. One quite historical now from 30 years ago. So Royds Community Association is a community-led development organisation that worked with funding through the single regeneration budget in the 90s to turn around a housing estate in Bradford to become one that is both economically successful through job creation and enterprise development through an enterprise park, but also socially better connected through a community and health centre, and with a strong focus on health and well-being. And that was an attempt by government to devolve power directly to a community organisation. And much as Joe has described, it then built a consortium locally. So it was the accountable body building a consortium locally, bringing other parties, including the public and private sectors, in alongside it. And more recently, we're seeing really exciting work similarly for example, in the Ambition Lawrence Western on the edge of Bristol, which is combining affordable housing and community energy to address poverty locally and address the social fabric and the physical fabric of the place in which it's based. So these are examples of community-led organisations that are already working on transforming their neighbourhoods. And with more power and greater funding going to these organisations, we could see much more of a revolution if we were able to push power down to the neighbourhood level. I just want to finish by saying I think we need to be brave enough to move funds away from Whitehall held funds, which enable people to compete in order to empower communities by pushing money down to the neighbourhood level. I think that's the clearest route through which we can really transform many of the left behind places that we're most concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's again a lot in that. The question about to what extent you can expect gains from overall performance improvements to trickle down to struggling estates in particular places is a really good one. And this point about being done by people versus done for people, I think is really profound knowledge. And that's funny if it takes us to our first set of questions. We'll take the first three neatly together, and if I can summarize them, because I don't know if people can jump on here. Richard asks about whether there are lessons to be learned from David Miliband's double devolution, which was about both devolving from central government to the local authority, but also from the local authority to community organisations. And we've sort of picked up that a bit in the chat already today. We talked about two different types of devolution, really. David asks about the work of parish and community councils. This may be an onward plant, this question, because we're so obsessed with parish councils. But actually, joking aside, it's a very good question. And Richard follows that up by saying, what is the 21st century equivalent of Burke's Little Platoon? So a few people talked about the community level. What does that mean, right? Is it the parish council? Is it community trusts? Is it like assets of community value? What exactly is it at that tier? And then Councillor Herbert asked a challenging question, which is just like, is the government serious about this? Are we drifting into targetology, micromanagement, reversing the kind of gains of the kind of localism agenda that we came into government with in 2010? So there's a sort of direction of travel question. And then after that, we're going to come to a next set of questions. So I'm going to unimaginatively to pick on our panelists in exactly the same order that we kicked off with. So we're going to start with Simon.
Thanks, Neil. And yes, I think those are excellent questions. And I mean, it was a theme of everyone who spoke after me that if you like, devolution within a local context matters as much as devolution from the centre to the local. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think had I double the time to speak, I think that would have been the next area that I would have wanted to look at, because this is complicated. I mean, I think it's absolutely right that we should look to devolve more imaginatively locally as well. I mean, clearly a lot of the focus of government is in the first instance upon making sure that we have these robust structures for city region style devolution. But there is undoubtedly a role, an important role here, I think, for truly local forms of devolution, both to protect things that are really important. And we see the seeds of some of this in the planning reform the government's undertaking, for example, but also to deliver on really local priorities, which are below that, which a metro mayor would typically look at, but nonetheless massively important for the individual communities affected. And I think there is a lot of interesting scope for, ironically, giving more powers to town and parish councils, even as you look to, I mean, I'm a big fan of unitary local government. I think you never hear of areas wanting to go back from unitary to two-tier, right? And I'm a big believer that strong unitary government is probably a sensible accompanying mechanism for mayoral devolution. But nonetheless, I think there is a very important role alongside that for truly local forms of government, which are very responsive to the needs and priorities and concerns of individual communities. And I would strongly support that in any sort of reformed structure of English local government. I think that is something where we struggle. I mean, I speak as a constituency MP. Only parts of my constituency have town and parish councils, and actually I see I think the areas that do not do lack a certain form of local protection against things being done to them. by larger authorities. And I think the areas that have those forms of government, although occasionally you hear people complaining about additional expense or council tax or whatever else, by and large, people would not want to see those councils go. And I'm sitting here in the market town of Gisborough. The town council elections on May the 6th are, if anything, every bit as fiercely contested as the borough council elections, and that speaks to the fact that people think this matters. So I'm keenly supportive of that double devolution model. I think we do need to make sure that all parish councils are capable of assuming these things. I recognise there are some enormously impressive town and parish councils out there, and I've worked with groups like NALC who are really good advocates for the work that they do. There is a variation in quality there, and you would need to make sure that you were comfortable from a central government perspective in making sure that these organisations were ready to assume these responsibilities. But by and large, I do think that if you devolve the powers, then people with the requisite talents and ability will step up. I think you have to operate on that premise that it's only by, if you like, making a leap of faith to entrust these powers that you ever see the uplift in the quality of local governance that you would need to see to make it work most effectively. And we in central government should be humble that we are not exactly endowed with a magic wand to get everything right first time either. And I think that that is an important recognition as part of this process. So yes, big fan of that. I think all of this is essentially in tune with the government's message on localism, which has been a constant theme since 2010. And I think that it does go to the point, and Philip made it very starkly, we are a very geographically uneven country. We do need to have models of local government that are as responsive as they can be to the very different local economies that exist between regions of the UK, but also within regions of the UK, and capturing that nuance and that extremely, often the fact that pockets of great affluence are right cheek by jowl to areas of great deprivation is something which you have to keep. As you build this system out, you have to become ever better at capturing the fact that the landscape really is a patchwork quilt of very different outcomes within very small geographies.
Joe, you talked about the shift to the very local level, the community level. What does that mean in practice? What are the different institutions? What could we do for what kind of institution?
Yes, I think it's already been touched on that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge the difference between whether it's kind of urban and rural, or even within a city or a town, different areas. There aren't parish councils everywhere. Parish councils do a brilliant job in some parts. I think the challenge is that we shouldn't be trying to design. We're making the same mistake if we try to design the localism piece in the same way that we design the kind of top-down model, because localism is about having the model that fits the local community in each local community, and therefore I think that it's certainly a challenge for government. But how to empower local communities to define the structure and the mechanism for their devolved power, I think is really key. And I'm sure that local authorities will happily play a role in that. And I said it in my speech earlier that I have a real issue with overloading the responsibility of local authorities to come up with the next level solution, because I do think that there are a large number of organisations in any wider community that maybe aren't entirely as engaged with local authorities because of the capacity issues of the local authority, not any desire not to work with them. So we have to kind of try and discover almost the undiscovered talents that are out there that are not currently being harnessed. And I think what we haven't actually mentioned at all this morning is the significant power of volunteering that we've discovered through COVID and through the kind of community activity, and how we harness the willingness of people to be involved in local communities, which has shifted, I think, in the last year, to say, now is an opportunity. I don't have any solutions, but I do think we need to come up with new solutions.
Very good. And so, Philip, I was going to prod on particularly this point about this micro differences between areas and really quite even a kind of neighbourhood level, and what kind of structures might get at that. There's obviously in the history of central government initiatives and local initiatives, but what can we learn from all that?
Actually, I'm just going to pick up on something that Joe said, which I think is really critical, and it actually cuts across all of the issues we're talking about, is how to define, how to help local communities, however we define those spatial units, to come up with the solutions or proposals of how to move forward. This is a flaw in the current system. And here I would probably slightly disagree with Simon. I think the city region model, that kind of approach is correct. The problem is that the Treasury itself doesn't know what to do. So the idea that you have a negotiation where central government in effect is acting as an arbiter as to whether locals are doing the right thing, are they going to promote good ideas? It seems to me that that's the wrong way to think about it. It's the centre has to learn from the local, and the local has to learn from the centre. It works both ways. And part of the problem is that local institutions have been starved in terms of capacity building for 3 decades. And that's the core element, that you need to start building capacity, providing the resources and the context to allow localities to start, if you like, visioning for themselves as to what is realistic. So in terms of the question about local, my view is you have to think in terms of the general subsidiarity principle. I mean, one of the arguments, of course, for leaving the UK was the subsidiarity argument, that you shouldn't be, in a sense, dictated to by higher powers when you can be doing it yourself. Well, but that argument is also correct within the UK. This is part of the devolution agenda, would need to be that powers need to be moved down to the levels, the lowest levels, which is meaningful for them to be actioned on. And rather than centralised in Whitehall, which would be the wrong way around. By the way, when I think of Whitehall and Westminster as all being part of the same problem. I don't blame civil servants at all. I mean, that would include think tanks, I'm sorry, Onward. You know, the fact that all our key thinking institutions are all in the same place, you know, it speaks to the problem itself. The question of what is local. If you go down to very local neighbourhood levels, those would be the kind of things that I would imagine would be really important around things like families, you know, local housing issues, educational aspirations. That's where the kind of laser-like focus on the local, certain aspects of issues regarding social care, community care, crime, that super local focus, it seems to me, would make the most sense. Although I'm not a specialist in this area, I would defer to somebody like Hilary Cottam on these areas. But if I think about international trade, foreign investment, then the local at that level is meaningless. It has to be a much bigger scale. But equally, having FDI policy and trade policy all orchestrated from the centre with a kind of a trade czar, to me, is also meaningless. You would need to think about something at the big region scale for trade, which is exactly what happens in Australia, what happens in Germany, what happens in the US. They're not done nationally. They're central, working with the regional, it's a big regional, for something like FDI, also skills training, innovation, those kind of entrepreneurial type activities, that seems to make sense. Whereas some of the social issues would be much more laser-like local focus. So what you would want is a system that allows for differentiation, for powers to be devolved and acted on so as to maximize the incentives for people to get involved. And I come back again to Joe's point, I think it's completely correct. We've got to build a space that allows people to take those, to respond to those incentives and to see the incentives first time round. Part of the problem in our system is that people are not aware of the incentives, or if they are, they get demoralized very quickly because it never works, or it very rarely works. And you see this in all the civic engagement data. The UK is very, very low on civic engagement outside of the southeast of England and parts of Scotland. The Midlands and the north of England are in the bottom third of the 4 quartiles of the OECD. They're in the lowest third, down with many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. That's where we are. The data doesn't tell lies. And, you know, this is also issues around well-being, happiness, and so on. You know, incentives and engagement are critical, but it requires different spatial configurations for different types of activities.
It's true that it's absolutely horses for courses, and funnily enough, Zoom is the kind of killer app for getting think tanks out of Westminster, because we finally have people from across the country to meetings. So come back again on this video, thinking about all these different institutions at that very local level, probably one of the leading thinkers on this. What is the answer here?
I mean, just to pick up a few things. I mean, I think we need to just, I mean, as Philip's just been saying, this is about multi-level governance. And I'm not suggesting that the neighbourhood level is the right level to deal with transport infrastructure. Clearly, different things belong at different levels. So we tend to, I don't know, in policy conversations like to be quite binary. It's either this or that. We're talking about what is rightly dealt with at which level of government. So I just wanted to make that point first. In terms of what is it at neighbourhood level that would hold power? I think Joe's absolutely right. I think the biggest mistake we could make is say that we need to parish the entire country. We know that different structures will work differently in different places because of all of those, like that granularity that Philip talked about. So I think my approach would be, we need a set of criteria that local accountable bodies need to fulfill. That may be in one area a neighbourhood forum, in a different area a town or parish council, in another area a long-established community anchor. So I think we have to, at that very neighbourhood level, have the capacity in government to hold different kinds of forms of entity accountable, but ensure that they are able to fulfil a common set of criteria. I also wanted to pick up on the question about, is the government serious about localism? I mean, I think the government's current approach shows very little trust for the local. So what we have is a lot of centrally held funds with competitions where the rules are decided by Whitehall. And so completely the opposite of what Joe described, which is we need local places, and Philip was talking about, to design their own vision for their future and be able to then act on that and kind of pull resources around that. What we have is Whitehall telling local places how to bid in particular competitions. And there are so many of these competitions now, it's quite hard to see how in a single place that can be turned into something cohesive. So I think that although there is rhetorically, a lot being talked about localism and the local, that's not translating into behaviour that really demonstrates significant trust in the ability of local people to define a vision for their local place and act on that and bring about improvement. So I'd say that there's some work to do in terms of really embedding what I understand to be localism.
Very good. So we have a certain set of questions here, which might in fact be our last set of questions, just because we're coming towards the end of our time. The first is really about the devolved authorities. We talk about Northern Ireland and how things are very different there. The same would Amanda, who's asking a question, also lives now in Scotland, and some of the complexities, by the way, these play out where you have really quite strong national level authorities. There's a second good question about something we kind of touched on before about what we're really trying to achieve here. Is it kind of measures of well-being and social well-being versus kind of crude economic measures? And then there's the third question from James about is there other geographies that we might want to think about that we could devolve things to? Could we just devolve to the local authority level? Could we give them the powers that the mayors have been given? Could we give it to local authorities that aren't in a combined authority working across a travel to work area? Lots of different possibilities about given that, as Philip has pointed out, the geography of and the kind of economic geography of the country so heterogeneous, you might want to have different things in different places. So I don't know, I think we might, for the purposes of this, start with Simon again for this thing on the DAs in particular, and then we'll take the order slightly randomly.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, the question of national devolution is obviously the elephant in the room in this discussion. We've been very English focused so far, and that partly reflects the fact that obviously when I was a minister, I was in essence focused on devolution overwhelmingly in the context of English local government. But clearly, on the 6th of May, we have very important elections for both Holyrood and the Senedd, and there is major work to be done in terms of what devolution within the United Kingdom should look like. I mean, I am unashamedly a unionist. I represent the Conservative Unionist Party. I am passionately committed to keeping the union together, and I believe we are, in every sense, economically and socially, stronger together. I therefore am very wary of further national level devolution within the United Kingdom. I think that it has, unfortunately, as bequeathed to us by the Blair government, given an ongoing ratchet towards independence, which is proving very difficult to reverse, particularly after the collapse of Scottish Labour in particular, which has pushed the entire non-Conservative vote into one place behind the Nationalists, and which does risk tearing apart the country I love. So I'm a big fan of further devolution within Scotland and Wales, and even more warily, given that I recognise its very unique politics and circumstances, Northern Ireland. But I would focus for preference upon devolution in the same way that we are devolving within England. So I would love to see, for example, a mayoralty of the Clyde region, or Edinburgh and its surrounds, or Aberdeenshire, because actually in many ways, I think we miss a trick by devolving powers from our political centre in Westminster to Scotland's political centre in Edinburgh, or Wales's in Cardiff, right? Because clearly exactly the same dynamic is playing out within those countries, that they are not one uniform homogenous zone. They face very different challenges across their different regions. And it does feel as though, if you like, our conversation around devolution within the national context has been at an entirely different level, one which we would never countenance doing within England. So I would like to see mayoral opportunities created at a much more local level in the other countries of the UK as well. I think beyond that, I mean, clearly, to take the other two questions briefly, yes, devolution is about more than economics. I mean, by dint of where I have come from as both a treasurer and local government minister, I have tended to view this through an economic lens, because levelling up, first and foremost, the primary thing is to try and get growth distributed more evenly, because without that, so much else struggles to flourish. And I've seen that, so vividly in my own area, but in so many others. If you don't have a normal economy, which isn't, hugely reliant on state subsidy, then how you galvanize some of the other stuff you would want to see, is a secondary question you really can't get to until you've addressed some of the social scarring of the massive economic failures that have bedeviled areas like the Northeast. But yes, I do believe that the two are fundamentally linked. As you resolve those economic challenges, then you do start, I hope, to see massive benefits. I mean, I look at the life chances of my constituents, from education to employment, and then on through mental and physical health. It is a major issue that there aren't good jobs which give good opportunities, good salary, which raise all the quality of life indicators in the way which you see in London and the greater southeast. We have to get that right, and then as you do that, then absolutely devolution becomes a social tool to try and address some of these problems. It is not right that life expectancy in my own constituency is probably between 10 and 15 years less than an area like Hampshire. And that's why devolution matters in every way, right? Not just as an exercise in distributing economic growth, but as an exercise in making sure that we are one country in a way which, ironically, you devolve precisely to create a greater unity of nation, I think. And that's a somewhat paradoxical way of looking at it. But it is at the moment we are a nation which is very strongly differentiated in terms of opportunity, and this is how you start to correct that balance. To the third question, briefly, about local authority devolution, I think a lot of our councils are very good, actually, and I work very closely with my own local authorities. I've worked in particular, obviously, in the context of town deals, future high streets funding, all the rest of it, and I see the passion and experience that there does still exist within local authorities to try and take these opportunities. I think they are good partners. What I would say is that we do need to look at spatial issues here and the economics of scale, because if you are looking at a lot of the big challenges that face the regions, and I know we don't want to talk in terms of regions exclusively, but some of these things do need a bigger outlook in terms of understanding the challenges that exist, because we don't, local authority boundaries any more than constituency boundaries, not hard lines in reality. They're just political lines on a map, and the issues and challenges and opportunities that exist will inevitably transcend those. And so you do need to be capable of working at a scale which lies somewhere beneath Whitehall knows best, and thinking that a small authority like Redcar and Cleveland can, on its own, address the functional economic challenges of a big area like the Tees Valley and its interaction with other neighbouring authorities who face very similar but subtly differentiated challenges.
The idea of devolving to unify, I think that's an interesting idea. I'm going to actually pick now on Vidya slightly arbitrarily, because she'd already mentioned in the discussion earlier on the piece by, I think it was Polar Economics, about what predicts people's welfare better. Is it community, social capital versus economic measures? So I wonder if I could prod you to particularly respond to that issue, but also to the other things.
Yes, and I think I would sort of take issue a bit with Simon in this context, because I don't think it's about let's sort out the economic in order to be able to then address the social. Though I recognise some of the challenges he's describing in his constituency. I think what the evidence is increasingly showing us is that there are social underpinnings to economic growth that we need to address. Social infrastructure, social capital are all important foundations for economic growth. So I think the need to see levelling up as both an economic and a social project is not which comes first and let's spread economic growth and then worry about the social. It's that the two are much more intertwined, I think, than we traditionally think and that regional economics traditionally recognises. So I think it's really critical that we look at those two in combination. I do think overall, most of us probably do agree that what we're actually after is an improvement in human well-being, not just growth in GDP. We just choose to measure progress in terms of GDP, which is a measure of activity rather than outcome. And I think increasingly we're sort of hitting up against the buffers of that as being the sole indicator that we're focused on. So I think there is a move towards thinking more broadly about what we're trying to achieve with levelling up, and that being much more about well-being than simple GDP. But I think to get there, we do need that combination of economic and social. In terms of existing structures, I mean, I do think there is an important role for local authorities, and potentially local authorities working much more in partnership with their local communities, seeing themselves as enablers of community level action and neighbourhood level action. I think one of the challenges there is that they are incredibly, they've been starved of resource for a long time now, and they're incredibly weak. And a devolution that requires more from local authorities is going to really struggle without greater investment into those local authorities. So unless we fix that, we're going to struggle to make that effective, I think.
A fair point. One of the most important powers though is money. So it's a good shout. We're going to go next to Philip, I think, on both these points. So you already touched on the devolved authorities, and I suppose the different experience of Wales and Scotland, I think, is interesting in all this. People do often say, there's something about the Scottish experience that is telling you something interesting, but then what do we glean from the differences between what's happened in Wales and Scotland?
Well, I think there are insights from the Scotland case and the Wales case, but they're also very context dependent. I mean, Wales is a functional geography, is not a functional geography, as you know well. I mean, North Wales is basically connected heavily to the northwest. South Wales is much more connected in the southwest. The links between North and South Wales economically are very limited because of the geography. So it brings back this point about the relationship between institutions and the economic structure. And I think Simon was very clear about that. I think that's correct. And I think this is where the city region model, the combined authority, does offer some possibilities forward. I think basically it's a sensible way forward. I just argue publicly it needs to be scaled up because the resources involved, the legal powers involved are actually tiny. I mean, it's much more the appearance of power rather than power de facto. I think it's a starting point, but we have a long way to go. I think Vidya's point is completely correct. Is the thing in terms of the economic and the social are absolutely intertwined, and we see this in all forms of evidence, and that's the case for it. That's why devolution needs to be driven. But the difficulty with the devolution argument, and it also comes to this multi-level argument, thinking about different configurations, areas which are rural areas, small town areas, the way that we might operate in a devolved environment would be very different to, say, the West Midlands conurbation. The problem is that the underlying resourcing. There is a lot of thinking now, as you know well, Neil, around devolved taxation. I mean, we already have steps in the direction around tax increment financing and so on. We do know that much more local funding has very positive aspects around growth and development and also good governance. We know that from OECD-wide data. The problem is it's a double-edged sword. Good governance driven by a lot of local funding, local taxation and so on, it works well if you start off from a blank piece of paper where everything's equal. The problem is introducing that in a system which is already extremely unbalanced actually provides enormous benefits for the winners. For the more prosperous places, by definition, can raise a lot more local finance. If you've got land supply constraints, most of it will be capitalized into land prices, which they can then recycle when they go to the money markets. Huge collateral positions to work from. Your hedging position is stronger, discount rates on finance will be lower. Whereas if you're in a weak place, you've got none of those advantages. Everything's moving against you. And we've already seen this in terms of what's happened in the United States, the huge financial partitioning between places, partly because of localized and devolved powers and administrative systems.
I'm going to jump into Till. I thought we have landed an incredibly important thought there in this discussion, which is it's not all just one way. It is a double-edged thing in devolution. But I'm going to use our last 2 minutes to bring in Jo, not least because she had one of the things that's kind of most challenging to business as usual in this conversation. So I'm going to give you the very last word on this, or anything else you want to talk to, Jo, and then we're going to wrap in about 60 seconds.
Great, thank you very much. So my key message is we can't do this as rapidly as the shovel-ready projects that government is asking for. If we're going to build community capacity, we have to do that first in order for then the community to say what it wants and what its priorities are. And I'm really keen to see, there has been money put into capacity building in local authorities like mine, but at the same time, they're asked to bid for things that need to happen yesterday. So we're out of sync with what we're wanting to happen in terms of localism and the way we're commissioning new projects and new work. So I think we need to look at that and see how we can, expedite community development capacity, and then, also listen to what the community is saying.
Very good. We've got too much content, too many interesting ideas to summarize neatly. I've written down a lot of notes. It's been useful for me. I hope it's been useful for other people who have attended. But really, Simon, Jo, Philip, and Vidya, thank you very much for your contributions this morning. We've got a lot from it, and I'm sure that a lot of people want to get in touch with you and continue the conversation. So thank all of you for coming as well. And pleasure to see you all here. Let's stay in touch with the Onward series on levelling up continues and rolls on. Please do go on the website, look at the other events, get involved in our other sessions, and we'll look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you. See you later.